This channel's for people who don't scare easy. If that's you, hit subscribe, turn the lights down, and get comfortable. What you're about to hear might follow you to sleep. You're hurtling down a lonely highway in the dead of night, the isolation pressing in, when suddenly your CB crackles to life with a voice that shouldn't exist. What would you do if the eerie silence gave way to whispers and warnings from somewhere just beyond your headlights? These truckers face that, and much worse. The American highway system isn't just a route from one town to the next. It's a network where stories travel faster than the rigs themselves, passed along in static-laced voices and late-night radio calls. Stick around as we count down 10 real CB encounters that will haunt you. Some say it all starts with a certain bridge in a forgotten corner of the country, where the past refuses to stay buried. Calvin Red Miller had logged nearly 30 years behind the wheel, and he thought he'd heard every kind of warning a trucker could get. But in October 2020, headed north through southern Utah on US Route 191, he found himself alone on a stretch of road that locals still speak of in hushed tones, Devil's Creek Bridge. The fog that night pressed in heavy, swallowing the headlights and making the world outside the cab feel impossibly far away. Red always figured the stories about this bridge were just another round of truck stop folklore, until his CB erupted with a burst of static and fear. "Southbound, don't stop, woman in white near the bridge." The warning came through broken, but the urgency was unmistakable. Red's hands tightened on the wheel. Another voice, more shaken, cut in. "She got my lights last time. Keep driving." Then only static. Red tried to brush it off, but as he rolled closer to the bridge, his headlights picked out a figure at the roadside. A woman dressed in white, waving both arms in the thick fog. He slowed, instincts warring with the warnings he'd just heard. The woman's face was pale, her dress streaked with dark stains. Before Red could decide whether to stop, his engine and lights cut out at once, leaving him stranded in the silence. In that instant, a child's whisper sounded from the darkness inside the cab. "Don't stop for her." The voice was close, too close. Heart pounding, Red looked down at his dash cam, the only thing still glowing. On the small screen, a shadow flickered behind the woman, tall and thin, shifting just out of focus. The engine roared back to life on its own. Red slammed the accelerator and crossed the bridge without a backward glance, the woman and the shadow swallowed by the fog behind him. Later, safe at a truck stop, Red reviewed the dash cam footage. The shadow was there, darting at the edge of the frame, never fully taking shape. He showed it to a local driver, who listened and nodded. The story, he said, went back to 1974, when a woman and her 6-year-old son drowned beneath that very bridge. Locals believe she still searches for her lost child, appearing to truckers on foggy nights, sometimes warning, sometimes luring. Red's encounter didn't end with the drive. For weeks he struggled with nightmares, visions of the woman's face, the shifting shadow, and the child's voice. His rig developed electrical problems, and more than once, he found muddy footprints on the steps despite parking on dry ground. The local sheriff told him he wasn't the first. At least 6 drivers had reported similar encounters since 1998, always on foggy nights, always near Devil's Creek Bridge. The advice was simple. If you see her, don't stop. Keep driving. Some folks you just can't help. Red avoids that stretch of highway now, but the legend endures. For truckers who cross Devil's Creek on nights when the fog rolls in, the isolation feels deeper, the road a little longer, and the voices on the CB just a little harder to ignore. But out west, there are other highways with their own secrets, places where the line between what's real and what's imagined gets thinner with every mile. Big Mike Hargrove knew Nevada's Highway 50 by heart. The road's isolation didn't bother him. What unsettled him most came during a dust storm one July night, when even the familiar became strange. He'd joined 3 other drivers outside Ely, their rigs forming a loose convoy, headlights cutting through the first hints of swirling sand. Convoys offered a sense of safety, shared radio chatter, the comfort of knowing someone else was out there in the dark. The storm built quickly, sand sweeping across the highway and swallowing the world outside their windshields. As the dust thickened, Mike kept his eyes on the taillights ahead, listening to the others on CB Channel 13. The banter was routine, voices steady, until the signal vanished all at once. No static, just a dead channel. Mike reached for his thermos, glanced in his mirrors, and realized the red dots of the trucks behind him were gone. He slowed, searching for any sign of the convoy, but the only thing in the mirrors was the swirling grit of the storm. He twisted the CB dial, hoping to pick up their voices on another channel. Instead, something else came through. A faint, tinny jingle, like an old radio commercial from decades past. The melody was repetitive, out of place, and it sent a chill through the cab. Then a voice, warped by static, barely more than a whisper. "Keep moving, don't look back." The words pressed in on him, and Mike's hands tightened on the wheel. He tried to convince himself it was just a prank, but the feeling in the pit of his stomach said otherwise. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Mike pushed on, headlights barely cutting through the storm. He watched as, one by one, the headlights of the trucks ahead blinked out, swallowed by the dust. There was no sign of wreckage, no sign of anyone pulling off to the side, just emptiness. The only sound was the wind and that old jingle, still drifting in and out on Channel 13. When the storm finally broke, Mike saw the glow of a gas station up ahead. He pulled in, nerves raw. Inside, the attendant looked up from his magazine, unimpressed by the storm or the late hour. Mike asked about the other trucks. If they'd come through, maybe just ahead of him. The man shook his head. "You're the only one I've seen tonight," he said. "No one else came by." Mike sat in his cab for a long time before moving on. Later he checked his dash cam. The footage showed the headlights of the other trucks vanishing one by one into the storm. There was no explanation. Other truckers told him about the legend, a convoy that disappeared in a sandstorm along Highway 50 back in 1972. Some said the road played tricks on drivers, that every few years someone else lost a convoy to the dust and the night. After that, Mike avoided running convoys down Highway 50 after dark. But sometimes, late at night, he'd still hear those old radio jingles on Channel 13, even when the CB was off. On the loneliest stretches of road, the past and present don't always stay separate. Sometimes, all it takes is a voice on the radio to remind you just how thin that line can be. And sometimes, the next voice you hear isn't calling out for company, it's calling for help. It was just after 4 a.m. on a foggy stretch of Route 23 in Kentucky when Tasha Green's CB radio broke the silence. The highway was empty, the thick, soupy fog pressing in from all sides, making the world feel smaller and more distant than it should. Tasha, a seasoned driver, kept her focus on the road, her CB usually tuned low at that hour. But on that March morning in 2021, a sudden, frantic voice cut through the static. "Someone, help me. I'm trapped. Please." She sat upright, listening as the plea repeated, the man's voice trembling and raw with fear. Switching to Channel 9, she tried to respond, asking for a location, but only static answered her. As she rounded a bend, her headlights swept across an old pickup truck, half buried in a ditch. The truck looked like it had been there for decades, rusted, tires flat, moss creeping along the edges of the windows. Tasha's sense of responsibility took over. She pulled her rig onto the shoulder and stepped out, boots sinking into the damp earth. Approaching the truck, she expected to see movement or at least some sign of recent activity. But the driver's door was locked, and the cab was empty. She walked a slow circle around the vehicle, searching for footprints or any disturbance in the mud. The ground was undisturbed, no tracks, no sign that anyone had left the truck, not even a scuff in the soft earth. The silence pressed in, and the only sound was the low hum of her own engine idling behind her. As she started back toward her cab, the voice erupted again on her CB, repeating the same desperate plea. This time it seemed to echo not just from the radio, but from the fog itself. Tasha climbed into her truck, closed the door and pulled away, her hands tight on the wheel. For the next 20 miles the voice clung to her radio, breaking through the static, always the same words. "Help me, I'm trapped." Never changing, never fading, until the first gray light of dawn began to break through the fog. Only then did the voice finally dissolve into silence. At the next truck stop, Tasha called the state troopers. When they arrived, they listened to her story and nodded, almost as if they'd heard it before. One officer explained that a pickup had crashed in that exact spot back in 1984. The driver was never found. The rusted truck, he said, matched the description, and she wasn't the first to report hearing that voice. Other truckers, especially on foggy mornings, had told similar stories, always the same desperate plea, sometimes following them for miles, always fading with the sunrise. Tasha still thinks about that morning. The voice lingers in her mind, and sometimes, when the fog settles in and the road grows quiet, she can't shake the feeling that someone is still out there, waiting for an answer. Out on the highways, where the world narrows to what you can see in your headlights, even a rest stop can feel like a place where something's watching. Ray Martinez, known to most as Chicago Ray, never expected much from a midnight stop at the Lincoln Rest area off I-55 in Illinois. He was used to the monotony of roadside pull-offs, just another concrete island with vending machines, faded signs, and the distant hum of passing traffic. That night, the lot was nearly empty. Only a few rigs sat scattered across the gravel, their engines ticking as they cooled in the darkness. Ray finished his walk-around, locked the doors, and climbed back into his cab, thinking only of a few hours' rest before the next haul. He had just leaned back in his seat when a faint, high-pitched laugh drifted in from outside. Ray paused, listening, but the sound didn't come from his radio. It was followed by the quick shuffle of footsteps over gravel, light, almost playful. He sat up, peering through the windshield, but the lot looked unchanged. That's when he caught a flicker of movement. A shadow darted between two trucks, low to the ground and gone in a blink. Ray's eyes swept the mirrors. More shadows followed, zigzagging between the parked rigs, their shapes too small and quick to be adult. The laughter grew, joined by whispers and the sound of children's feet running just out of sight. Ray gripped the steering wheel, every sense on edge. He reached for his CB, hoping another driver was awake, but before he could speak, the radio sputtered with static. Then a child's voice began to sing, a nursery rhyme, the tune old and slightly off, as if it belonged to another time. The words were hard to catch, but the melody felt familiar in a way that made his skin crawl. Later, Ray would realize it matched songs popular in the 1950s, the era when the nearby orphanage burned. He waited, motionless, as the giggling and singing circled his cab. The shadows seemed to press against the glass, never quite visible, always moving just out of the corner of his eye. The sounds faded as suddenly as they'd started, leaving Ray alone in the thick silence. He didn't sleep much after that. At first light, Ray stepped out to check his trailer. What he found stopped him cold. Tiny handprints smeared through the dust on the back door, each one no bigger than a child's, scattered in no pattern he could make sense of. The sight left him unsettled in a way he couldn't shake. Without a second thought, Ray decided he would never stop there again. Later, at a nearby truck stop, he shared what happened. The old-timers nodded, telling him about the orphanage fire in the 1950s and the stories that followed. Children's laughter, nursery rhymes, and shadows that only appeared to drivers alone at night. Some truckers claimed to wake up with unexplained bruises after parking there. Ray heard enough to know his experience wasn't unique, but it didn't make it easier to forget. He now warns other drivers to keep moving past the Lincoln rest area, no matter how tired they feel. There are places on the road where the past lingers, and some encounters leave questions that never quite fade. Sometimes it isn't the distance or the darkness that unsettles a driver. It's the sense that the road itself can hold you in place, refusing to let you go. Samir Patel's run through Pennsylvania in April 2023 was supposed to be routine. Just another overnight haul, medical supplies bound for Pittsburgh. He'd heard the stories about Sidling Hill Tunnel, a closed stretch of the old Pennsylvania Turnpike abandoned since 1968. Most drivers gave it a wide berth, but Samir figured an empty tunnel would mean fewer delays. He didn't think twice when he turned onto the access road and saw the black mouth of the tunnel waiting ahead. The moment his tires crossed the threshold, the atmosphere changed. The air inside pressed in, thick and unmoving, carrying a cold that didn't match the spring night outside. His headlights barely made a dent in the darkness. The tunnel walls, streaked with decades of grime and graffiti, seemed to close in on both sides. About a quarter-mile in, Samir's GPS froze. The map locked up, the glowing line marking his route stuck just inside the tunnel entrance. He glanced at the dashboard clock, 3:15 a.m., though he could have sworn it was closer to midnight. A few minutes later, his CB radio crackled to life. At first, it was only static, but then the noise shifted. Old news broadcasts spilled out in broken fragments. A weather report from the 1960s, a clipped headline about President Johnson and highway legislation, a voice reading stock numbers long out of date. The broadcasts overlapped and faded until a new voice cut through, low and hollow. "Keep your eyes forward," it said. "The watchman sees all." Samir gripped the wheel and stared straight ahead. He didn't question the warning. Something in the tone left no room for doubt. The tunnel stretched on in a way that didn't make sense. The walls glided past, but the end never seemed to come. No matter how long he drove, the darkness stayed the same. The only sound his own breathing and the faint hum of the engine. His phone sat dead on the seat beside him, and the dash lights flickered, offering no help. It felt like an hour had passed when the darkness finally broke. Without warning, the tunnel's far end appeared, and Samir's truck rolled back out into the pale blue of early morning. He checked the dashboard clock again. Only 5 minutes had gone by. The GPS, still frozen, blinked back to life as if nothing had happened. Later, at a truck stop outside Pittsburgh, Samir mentioned the tunnel to a group of older drivers. They traded uneasy glances. One told him the stories were older than most of the rigs on the road, drivers losing time, hearing voices, and sometimes seeing things in the dark that didn't belong in any tunnel. The mention of the watchman made the group fall quiet. Samir never used that shortcut again. The warning stayed with him, a reminder of how quickly the road can change. For some drivers, the strangest encounters aren't with what's ahead, but with what waits just out of sight, sometimes on a lonely highway, sometimes in the shape of a stranger by the side of the road. Lucky Ed Simmons spent most nights trusting his instincts and the steady rhythm of the highway. On a September night in 2016, nearing midnight on U.S. Route 6, just outside LaPorte, Indiana, he found himself relying on that gut feeling more than ever. The road stretched out in a long, empty line, the only light coming from his headlights and the faint glow of the dashboard. Route 6 had a reputation. Stories passed between truckers about strange signals and things seen out of the corner of your eye. But Ed had never given them much thought. As he eased through a gentle curve, his CB radio cut through the quiet with a burst of static. The voice that followed was sharp and accented, as if the speaker was sitting right beside him. "Can you give me a ride to the next crossing?" the man asked, the words clear despite the distance. Ed scanned the roadside and spotted a lone figure standing near the shoulder, illuminated in the edge of his high beams. The man was tall and thin, wrapped in a battered coat, one hand raised in a slow wave. What caught Ed's attention most were his eyes, electric blue, almost glowing, cutting through the dark in a way that made Ed's hands tense on the wheel. Hitchhikers weren't rare on that stretch, but something about this one felt off. Ed slowed instinctively, torn between caution and the reflex to help. Just as his foot touched the brake, his CB crackled again. The same accented voice whispered, "You're almost there," before the radio dropped into silence. When Ed glanced back to the roadside, the man was gone. No trace, no movement, just the empty shoulder dissolving into the night. Ed pressed the accelerator, his heart pounding, and watched the mirrors for any sign of the stranger. Nothing followed. The CB sputtered now and then, but no words came through, only a low, steady hiss. When Ed finally stopped for coffee at a diner an hour down the road, he told the waitress what had happened. She listened, her face unreadable, then asked, "Blue eyes?" Ed nodded. She explained that in 1979, a drifter known for his piercing blue eyes had been killed hitchhiking not far from there. Over the years, other truckers had reported seeing him, always at night, always vanishing before anyone could stop. The story might have ended there, but the next morning, as Ed cleaned out his cab, he found a single blue marble resting on the seat beside him. Its surface caught the light in a way that seemed unnatural. Ed knew it hadn't been there before. When he mentioned it to other drivers, they nodded knowingly. Some said finding the marble meant good luck was coming. Others warned it brought a week of strange misfortune. More than a few had found one themselves after a late-night encounter on Route 6. Ed keeps the marble tucked in his glove box, a quiet reminder of that night and the choice he made. He doesn't stop for hitchhikers anymore, no matter how harmless they seem. The memory lingers, sharpening his sense of what might be waiting just beyond the edge of the headlights. Out on old highways, the past hangs close to the present, sometimes in a voice on the radio, sometimes in a warning you can't quite explain. Some drivers say these stories are nothing but nerves and long hours. Others know better. The road has a way of holding on to what it's lost, and every so often it finds a way to speak. For Yolanda Cruz, the West Texas desert had always meant open skies and long, quiet hours behind the wheel. But in May 2022, as she drove eastbound on I-10 near Van Horn, the familiar landscape shifted into something she couldn't explain. The CB radio, usually a steady companion, began to fill with a different kind of sound, one that set her nerves on edge. It started as a faint static, barely louder than the hum of her engine. Yolanda was used to the quirks of highway radio, but this was different. The static thickened and, beneath it, a melody began to take shape. It was slow and mournful, a hymn sung in perfect harmony by what sounded like an entire choir. The tune was unfamiliar, but it tugged at something deep inside her, a sense of longing and loss that didn't belong to any ordinary song. Truckers in the area called it the Van Horn Hymn. As the voices swelled, the emotion in the music was clear, hope and heartbreak woven together, the words themselves lost in the mix. Yolanda's eyes flicked to the shoulder, where her headlights caught a procession of shadowy figures moving in step along the edge of the road. Men in faded suits and women in old-fashioned church dresses walked with their heads bowed, their faces hidden, their movements slow and synchronized. The style of their clothing belonged to another time, and the sight of so many together, silent and solemn, made the air in the cab feel heavy. Her headlights began to flicker, not just once, but in a steady, unnerving rhythm, as if the very air around her truck was shifting. The hymn grew louder, filling the space between her and the figures outside. Yolanda's hands tightened on the wheel. She considered stopping, but the atmosphere pressed her to keep moving. The figures never looked her way, never acknowledged the truck rolling past. They just continued their march, step after step, their shadows stretching out behind them. As she passed the last of the marchers, Yolanda glanced in her rearview mirror. The figures had vanished, swallowed by the darkness without a trace. Yet the hymn lingered, echoing through her CB radio for nearly 6 miles. The song faded only when the desert finally opened up again and the lights on her dash steadied. At her next stop, Yolanda shared what she'd seen with another driver. He nodded, explaining the legend tied to the stretch of Interstate 10 near Van Horn, a church bus crash in 1965 that claimed more than a dozen lives. Every spring, he said, drivers hear the choir and see the ghostly marchers, always dressed in those same old-fashioned church clothes, always accompanied by the Van Horn hymn on the CB. Yolanda avoids that part of I-10 during spring now. The memory of the flickering lights and the choir's song stays with her, a reminder that not everything on the highway can be explained or left behind. Every spring, drivers on Interstate 10 near Van Horn report the same hymn and shadows, a warning that some echoes on the road never truly fade. Some fires burn brighter in memory and in the shadows of the road. For Pete McAllister, Grizzly. Pete, to those who knew him on the radio, the Oregon coast was a place where the line between danger and beauty blurred. Highway 101 near Coos Bay wound through fog-shrouded forests and rain-slicked cliffs, a stretch of road where accidents and strange stories seemed to collect. Pete had seen his share of both, but what happened one January night in 2018 left him questioning everything he thought he knew about the job. He was rounding a familiar curve, headlights sweeping through the mist, when a wall of fire appeared ahead. A semi-truck stood on the shoulder, engulfed in flames that roared upward, bright enough to turn the wet pavement gold. There was no sound but the rush of his own engine and the hiss of the fire. Pete slowed, watching as the smoke rolled across the road. The flames seemed to burn without consuming anything, too intense and steady to be real. He reached for his CB, ready to call for help, but before he could speak, the radio erupted with static. Then, through the noise, a man's voice broke through, raw, desperate, and unmistakably close. "Water! I'm burning!" The agony in those words made Pete's grip tighten on the wheel. He looked back toward the burning rig, but in an instant, the fire and the truck were gone. The shoulder was empty. There was no glow, no heat, not even a scorch mark on the asphalt where the inferno had been. Pete sat frozen, CB mic still in hand as the voice faded into silence and the static died away. He tried to tell himself it was a trick of the light or exhaustion playing games, but the memory pressed in, sharper than the cold air seeping through the window. At the way station the next morning, Pete mentioned what he'd seen. The attendant's face hardened as he listened. then explained that a trucker had died in a fiery crash on that very curve exactly 10 years earlier. "You're not the first," he said. "Drivers see the flames every January. Most keep moving." Pete learned that those who stopped at the site often reported their CB radios malfunctioning for weeks, crackling with voices that shouldn't be there, sometimes refusing to work at all. It was a detail that matched Pete's own experience. His radio never sounded quite right after that night. Other truckers shared their own stories: phantom flames, radios gone haywire, and a sense of being watched on that stretch of 101. Some believed the burning rig was a warning, the last moments of a driver caught in a tragedy the road wouldn't let go. Pete never found a better explanation. He avoided the urge to stop, even when headlights flickered or shadows on the shoulder looked like flames in the mirror. The story became something he carried with him, a private reminder of how quickly the familiar can turn strange. On highways where the weather changes in an instant and the past lingers just out of sight, drivers know to watch for more than just what's in the headlights. Sometimes it's the footprints that appear in the snow or the voices that drift through the static that leave the deepest mark. On Highway 212 near the Crow Reservation, winter brings a kind of silence that settles over everything. In December 2021, just after 1 a.m., Jasmine Lee steered her reefer truck through the Montana darkness, the snow piling high along the shoulders and the road stretching out in a cold, unbroken line. For hours, she'd seen nothing but the reflection of her own headlights and the swirling white beyond the glass. The CB radio's low static was a comfort, a reminder she wasn't completely alone, until the static shifted and something else began to seep in. It started softly, a child's voice rising above the static, the melody of a lullaby threading through the cab. Jasmine listened, uncertain at first if she was imagining it. The song was gentle, meant to soothe, but out here it felt wrong. Too lonely, too clear, as if the voice was meant for her alone. She spun the dial, searching for another channel, but the lullaby followed her, persistent and unbroken. The sound filled the truck, growing sharper as she rounded a bend where the snow seemed even deeper. That's when she saw the girl. A small figure in a white dress stood by a snowbank, motionless in the pale wash of Jasmine's headlights. The dress was out of place, thin, old-fashioned, the kind of thing no one would wear in this cold. Jasmine slowed, heart pounding, and brought the rig to a stop a short distance away. She watched for any sign of movement, but the girl only stood there, head bowed, hair tangled by the wind. The lullaby grew louder, echoing through the CB and the cab. Jasmine stepped out, boots crunching into the snow. The cold bit through her jacket as she approached, eyes darting from the girl to the empty road. But as she drew near, the figure vanished. There were no footprints in the snow where the girl had stood, just untouched drifts, smooth and undisturbed. Jasmine's own tracks were the only mark on the ground. She turned back toward her truck, uneasy, and the lullaby followed her, still playing through the radio, even as she climbed inside and drove away. The song lingered for miles, trailing her long after the highway curved away from the reservation. It faded only as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, leaving Jasmine with a sense of something unfinished. Later, at a rest stop, she spoke with a tribal police officer who listened quietly before telling her about a girl who went missing in a blizzard during the 1980s. Searchers never found her, and over the years, other drivers had reported seeing a child in white or hearing a lullaby on the radio near that same stretch of road. The officer explained that among the Crow people, some spirits remain not to frighten, but to be remembered, to reach out, hoping someone will notice. Jasmine couldn't shake the feeling that the girl was searching for connection, not harm. In the nights that followed, She dreamed of icy roads and distant voices, the lullaby echoing in her mind. Other truckers who've encountered the same voice on Highway 212 say the memories stay with them, sometimes returning in dreams for weeks. On the open road, warnings don't always come as words. Sometimes it's the things you see or hear when you least expect them that urge you to pay attention to what's just ahead. Fog can turn even the most familiar highway into a different world. For Frank Hollywood DeLuca, that lesson became real on I-95 near Bangor, Maine in October 2019. Frank was used to the strange tricks of the night, shifting shadows, the occasional burst of static on the CB, and the kind of silence that settles in around 4 a.m. But that morning, as he eased his rig through a bank of fog so thick it seemed to swallow the road whole, nothing felt routine. He first noticed the headlights in his mirror, a matched pair, steady and unwavering, always the same distance behind him. They didn't fall back, didn't creep closer, just held their place in the gray. Frank figured it was another trucker trying to stick close for safety. He keyed his CB, voice steady as he called out, "You behind me want to give a little space?" Visibility's rough tonight. The reply came back instantly, but it wasn't what he expected. The voice was garbled, crackling with static, and not quite right. "Don't stop," it said. Then, after a pause, repeated, "Don't stop." Frank's hands tightened on the wheel. The warning echoed in the cab, carrying a weight that made him uneasy. He checked his mirrors again, but the headlights never wavered. For miles they trailed him, a constant presence in the fog. He tried to shake the feeling that something was off, telling himself it was just a cautious driver, maybe someone nervous in the weather. Still, the message on the CB stuck with him. The road stretched on, the fog thickened, and the world outside the cab felt smaller with every mile. Then, without warning, the headlights veered sharply to the right. Frank braced for the worst, expecting the glow to disappear into the ditch or the sound of a crash. But there was nothing. No screech of tires, no impact, no movement in the fog. The lights simply flickered and vanished. Frank slowed, scanning the shoulder and the nearby woods for any sign of an accident. There were no tire tracks, no broken glass, not even a mark on the wet pavement. The fog pressed in, and the road behind him was empty. Rattled, Frank made it to a small diner just off the interstate as the sun started to rise. He nursed a coffee and finally told his story to the group of drivers gathered at the counter. The room grew quiet. An older trucker leaned in, voice low, and told Frank about the rig that crashed in the same spot back in the 1970s. The driver never made it home. Since then, local legend says, a pair of headlights will follow lone truckers on foggy nights, offering a warning to those who know to listen. Those who heed the message, who keep driving and don't stop, are said to avoid accidents for a year. Others, the old-timer added, aren't so fortunate. Frank never forgot the encounter. He kept the warning in mind on every foggy run after that, never stopping when headlights lingered too long in the mist. The story passed from one driver to the next, a reminder that sometimes the road itself tries to protect you, even if its methods are hard to understand. Out there on the highway, where the line between fact and legend blurs, a single warning can make all the difference. The highway is more than a stretch of pavement. It's a place where reality thins, and the past lingers just out of sight. For truckers, each trip means crossing into a world where boundaries blur, and every mile carries its own risks. The stories you've heard tonight are not just tales, but warnings repeated year after year, from whispers in the CB to phantom headlights in the fog. These encounters remind us that some roads hold on to their secrets, and some warnings are meant to be heeded. Next time your CB crackles at 3 a.m., Will you answer? If these stories chilled you to the bone, hit like and subscribe for more real-life highway horrors.